Good morning, everyone. Brian Truman, first episode of my new podcast, and I'm very excited. And it is called Foundations to Fortune. And I wanted to spend this first episode and kind of talk about where I came up with the name, why, and then tell a little bit about maybe my story. But after years of talking to a lot of investors, going to different conferences, hearing people speak, there seemed to be a common theme, and that was that everybody had an origin story of either how they got into what they were doing today, their growing up years, that they had different things happen in their life that led them to become an investor or whichever path that they chose in life, whatever industry they went into, whether it's being a financial advisor or whether it was an investor into multifamily or some kind of commercial real estate. But they all had a story and an origin story. And so I felt like it would be good for people on this podcast to be able to hear people's stories. And so, yes, we will talk about real estate, but I also want to talk about their path and their journey. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about my story. So I grew up in a very, very small town. There was all of maybe 1,000 people in my hometown. My graduating class was 22 students. And when I was in high school, very few kids ever went to college, but I had a mother who was very adamant that all of her kids were going to go to college. And I'm the youngest of 7. So 6 of the 7 of us all went to college, all graduated college, all of that. I spent 22 years in corporate America, left out of that, started a company, grew it to be the largest one in Nashville, signed over ownership to that, another party who approached me about wanting to purchase the business. Then I went into real estate, which was 9 years ago. But what seems to catch people's attention most when I go and appear on podcasts or go and speak is how did I get into doing nothing but multifamily? Because that's what I do today. Is 95% of my time is spent helping investors, family offices, private equity companies buy and sell multifamily. And so everybody wants to know the story about how that started, which got started just a couple of months after I got my license, started working with my wife, Jana Truman. There was the 2 of us, and it was the Saturday before Christmas of 2016. We were getting ready to go to dinner, and it was 6:30 at night. My phone rings, and I see the area code on it, which I knew the area code from all my years of being in corporate America and traveling. I knew that area code was Los Angeles, was LA. It did not come up with a name, said unknown. And normally I didn't answer those kind of calls. I was like, hey, if it's that important and it's 6:30 on a Saturday, somebody will leave me a message. But for some reason, I went ahead and answered that call. The gentleman on the other line proceeded to say, hey, Brian, I got your name from he first said his name, which I'll leave out of this story, but he said his name, said that he had got my information from a residential realtor that he had just found off of Facebook here in residential realtor here in Nashville. And that this guy really needed my help because he was in a real pickle and a real bind. So I proceeded to ask him, what bind are you in? So what's happening? So he said, well, I realized that I only have until midnight tonight to identify my 3 properties or my properties for my 1031 exchange. Now, remember, this is 6:30 at night on a Saturday, right? So he said, yeah, I'm in this bind. And I said, yes, you are in a serious bind. I agree with that. And so he asked me, I sold some properties here in LA. I want to buy multifamily in Nashville. So can you help me identify some properties? And so I took a deep breath to think, okay, let's see. I've had my license all of maybe 2 months now. And so multifamily, okay, that wasn't necessarily where I thought I was going to go into per se on the commercial world. But I did recall and remember that when I went through real estate school, there was a guy in my class that when we got talking and I told him that I would probably end up doing commercial real estate, he had proceeded to tell me that his stepfather had 5 multifamily properties. And so when I got thinking about that, I thought, you know what? That's the only person right now, since I'm only 2 months into my license, that I knew to call. So I told this gentleman, I was like, hey, give me 15 minutes. Let me call a guy. Let me see what I can find. So I went ahead and called this gentleman that was in my real estate class. And I said, hey, I know your stepfather had 5 multifamily properties. This is what I'm looking for. I got a guy that needs to do a 1031. And would your stepfather be interested in accepting an offer on 1, 2, 3, any of his properties? And so he said, well, you know what? Give me 15 minutes. Let me give him a call and I'll call you back. So by the time we got to dinner, sat down, had just ordered, my phone rings. It's a gentleman calling back, the agent calling, the agent that I had went to real estate school with, calling me back and said, hey, talk to my stepfather. He actually has 3 properties that he would be willing to accept offers on. So I said, all right, go ahead and send me those 3 properties. He texted me the name of the property, the addresses of those properties. So he went ahead and sent those to me. I called the gentleman back in California, who would become a client, obviously. Called him back and said, all right, you're in luck. This is an absolute miracle, but you're in luck. I'm going to go ahead and text you the name and addresses of 3 properties. And so you can go ahead and give these to your 1031 intermediary to put down, which will make your midnight deadline that you need to have, these 3 properties to him. So that's what we did. We went ahead and I sent those to him. We proceeded to make offers on all 3 of those properties. And then, and again, never met this guy until he had called, didn't know anything about him, any of that, but we made the offers. Offers were accepted after a little bit of negotiation. The gentleman said, all right, I'm going to fly out after New Year's to come and look at them. We'd lined up doing inspections and so forth. So when he first called, he said, I'm going to come out, do the inspections. I'll just be coming by myself. Well, then the next thing I know, he calls back and he said, I'm going to bring my wife, and we just had a new baby, so we're going to bring our baby with us. I was like, okay. So I agreed to, I said to him, hey, I'll just pick you up at the airport. How's that? That'd make maybe life a little easier for you. Then we can, spend a couple of days doing the inspections, looking around at the properties. And so I asked him what airline he was going to be coming in on. And he said, well, I won't be coming on any of those airlines. We always fly private. So then I'm really thinking, okay, so who is this guy? Because to fly private isn't cheap. So I arrange, go to pick him up. He comes off the plane, his wife, child, video photographer, a couple other people in tow. And so then I'm really, in my mind going, who is this guy? And so he comes off, find out he's a good friend of Grant Cardone's, and who was the one that referred him or told him he ought to buy in Nashville and in Tennessee. And so that's kind of how I got started, but it even goes further than that, in that this gentleman puts on a big conference in California every year. The conference was coming up not too long after this whole process of us going under contract, him purchasing property. And he invites us to come down to his conference in LA. He said, hey, since you helped me get these, I'm going to go ahead and comp you tickets. We're going to put you right up on the front row or so. And so that's what ended up happening. We went to this conference. There was probably 1,000 people in attendance. And so Grant Cardone, Elena Cardone was there, along with a number of other big time speakers, Tim Grover and Bradley and a number of others speakers. So we were sitting with them, and the first morning of the conference starts. We're leading up until lunchtime. And again, we're sitting on the front row. So the gentleman said right before lunch, he told his rags to riches story, kind of like where I'm telling this story of how I got into this origin story. He kind of told his origin story of how his rags to riches. He slept in a vehicle for probably 6, 7, 8 months, was homeless, other things growing up. But then he had got into doing some, real estate and kind of got into his career. But he told the story of how he sold his properties in LA and decided to buy some property in Tennessee. And he said, oh, by the way, my Tennessee realtor is here. He's like, hey, Brian, where are you? And he's looking way out into the crowd, knowing that I was sitting right there in front of him, right there on the front row. So he said, hey, Brian, where are you? I raised my hand. He's like, hey, stand up. So I stand up. And again, this is right before lunchtime. And we were supposed to go kind of have a private lunch with several of the speakers. And so as soon as he ended his speech, and he had mentioned, anybody that's looking for property in Tennessee, this is my realtor, this is the guy, this is who you need to talk to. Well, as soon as he ended, we went to stand up. I got mobbed from all sides. And the row of the tables were such that I had to go out one way or another, and people were coming in those rows, and I couldn't get out. And they were wanting to come and talk to about properties and saying, hey, how can you help me? So forth. But again, we were supposed to go have lunch. So I had looked to Jana and said, you know what? You go have lunch. I'll answer some questions. I'll come and join you guys when we get done. When I get done answering questions. Well, an hour and a half later, I'm still there, standing there, boxed in. No way to really get out unless I wanted to push people over and try to get through. So I sat there for an hour and a half and answered questions. Well, what that led to is us coming back from that conference where I had a whole list of now buyers of people that wanted multifamily properties. And so that's really when people ask me, how did you get started in doing nothing but multifamily? That's that is the story right there. And so since day one of that happening for the next 9 years, the one thing I've never had to worry about is having buyers of properties. Because I came back from there. Remember, there was 1,000 people at that conference. So I came back from 2 days of being at that conference with hundreds of people to help. And those people that came to his conference were from, there was a lot from California because that's where the conference was held. But he had a following, too, of people from all over the country. So I came back with a big list of buyers from all different parts of the country, back east, Texas, the down south, and always have buyers. And it's interesting, and I didn't. So if you ask me, wow, how do you think your real estate career is going to start and go and move along? That is not what I thought was going to happen. That here I was going to be going on a Saturday before Christmas to dinner and get that kind of call, from somebody that I didn't know. And again, that, a gentleman just referred, to me, this guy to have him call me. And then the fact that I had, you think about all the pieces of that story, right? The fact that I had somebody that I went to real estate school that had a stepfather that had some properties, how that all came about, and then going to this conference and having him, ask me to stand up, and then ending up with, hundreds of people to look for properties for and to find properties. And so that's kind of my origin story of how I got into this. And it's interesting when I go on podcasts, a lot of people want to know the story, how I got into multifamily. So I tell that story, and people seem to be extremely fascinated, because not everybody's going to run into somebody that, happens to be at that time, that close to Grant Cardone. and just the whole story of having him come off a plane, with a video photographer, and in my mind going, so who is this guy? Who are we dealing with there? It's very, very fascinating story. Still friends with obviously the client, today, still buying properties. And so because of that, like I said, for this podcast, everybody has an origin story of how they've got in. So I'll be interviewing a lot of people who are investors. I've got people that will be coming in to be interviewed that are not just in the commercial space, but also people that maybe be started a car museum. How did they ever get into all of that? So all different aspects of life will be talking. There's a gentleman that started out, buying building kind of his first house. Now he builds multiple houses and has grown his net worth to be an incredible amount. And he's, in his mid-20s. So, he's very young. So there's just so many, stories to tell. And that's the whole point of this, is how people, what their foundation was. Some of them very humble circumstances they started out, but the different, maybe if you want to call them, breaks in life that they got in, or mentors that they had, or people that have given them advice over the years to get to where they are. And I love hearing those stories. And I think the audience is going to thoroughly enjoy hearing the stories of not only just real estate investors, but people in all different walks of life. and their their foundations and their stories. So that's what this podcast is going to be about. So for the first one, I just kind of wanted to share a little bit of mine. Mine's not near as dramatic as some of the ones that you're going to hear for some of the people that we have lined up for the podcast. But I just wanted to kind of let the audience know where the thought came from and the concept for the podcast. So thank you for joining our podcast. Here on out, it'll be more than just me. You'll get to see somebody else sitting across the table here for me doing the interviewing of them. But appreciate people listening in. Thank you. And until the next first podcast, which will be Trey Palmetto, until then, thank you and have a great day.